Behind the Shades.
So I'm Sue Stevenson. I'm the founder and CEO of U-Turn Anxiety. And I what I do is I empower parents and educators with the skills, and I'm saying skills intentionally, I'll get to that, but the skills they need to support anxious kids so that those kids get to thrive with courage and calm confidence, so that they're no longer being held back by anxiety. They get to live life full of possibilities. It's limitless. So many people actually think that anxiety is something that they're stuck with for their whole life, whereas I describe anxiety as an emotional state that you're in, and it's actually meant to come and go. It's not meant to stay with us forever. And many people think it does stay with them, that that's who they are, and they identify themselves with it, but it doesn't have to be that way. So it's very exciting and it's very cool what I'm doing, because I'm showing people that it doesn't have to be that way, and how they can change things, how they can turn things around.
So take us through the genesis of this. How did you get started and why?
Yeah, I love that question. So I worked as a teacher for 32 years in the school system. Absolutely love working with kids. I just think kids are the best. And I think they're very underrated at times and not acknowledged for how smart and able they are. They're just as important as us adults, every bit as important. In fact, I think you could almost say more so, because they're the future. So I love working with kids. So I loved teaching kids. What I noticed was that there were many kids. I got into the wellbeing space. So I qualified myself to become student wellbeing. I got into the wellbeing space, the health space, and I was teaching, and I was in leadership and student management. And I pretty much saw it all. I saw, yes, you've got all these kids that fit in and, they cope, but there's a lot of kids that don't. And there's a lot of kids that are experiencing real struggles and challenges in life. And I felt like the system wasn't helping those kids very well. I would say the system was letting many kids down, the kids who were struggling or feeling the challenge. And I think what I began to realize was that there was a bit of a disconnect between what kids need and what the adults in their world think they need. And I noticed that if we don't tune into our kids and help them be who they are and help them thrive and be their, what I describe as their true self, what happens is us adults can often impose what we think kids should be doing and how they should be living their life and what they should be learning and how they should be learning and all these things. And we tend to impose a lot onto kids. So then kids can feel quite conflicted because they're trying to fit in to what they should be doing. And that is anxiety provoking in itself, because they're living out of alignment with, many kids can be living out of alignment with who they really are and what they're meant to be, who they're meant to be. This can happen in the home, this can happen in the school, it can happen anywhere. So I found that there was often a disconnect between what adults think kids need and what they should be doing and what kids actually need and should be doing for themselves. So I started to realize that if we don't tune into kids and we don't connect with them at a really deep level, and we don't value them, like really value them and honour them, then there's a disconnect, and those kids can lose trust in the adults in their world. And they can feel quite alone and can feel quite misaligned and conflicted. So I'm not blaming adults, because I'm one. And I certainly stuffed up plenty of times. It's not until I began to realise what kids need that I started to change myself too. And for me, it all started really, I was in the school system, but I was really prompted because I was a parent. And I thought I knew what I needed to do as a parent. I thought I knew what my kids needed. And it turns out that I thought I was a pretty good parent, but now that I look back, I stuffed up quite a lot. And I contributed to my children's anxiety. And it turns out that my daughter, my oldest daughter, it all started with her because we kind of hit crisis point. She was behaving in ways, she was very tumultuous, she was in turmoil, she was emotional, she was anxious, but I didn't know that at the time. I didn't even know what anxiety was. So I've come a long way. And I was raising this child who was, in my head, impossible. Like, she was difficult, she was high maintenance. I was just labeling her and putting all these things on her, thinking that it was her, until we hit crisis point and I went and sought some help. Unfortunately, that help wasn't helpful for me. So then I went further, and then I started my own journey. And I thought, well, this isn't good enough. I'm being told that I'm doing the best I can, but I've got a child in crisis and a relationship with my child in crisis. I've got to do better than this. So I started exploring, and I started my own personal journey. And part of that journey was taking a damn good look at myself in the mirror and looking at what I was doing and how I was functioning. And guess what I discovered? I discovered that I had experienced anxiety for 4 decades, every day of my life. And it was significant. I discovered now what anxiety was. And I knew my story because I'd been an extremely anxious kid. I didn't know, I didn't have a label for it. Back then, I just thought there was something wrong with me. My parents and my brothers and sisters told me there was something wrong with me and just to shut up and stop carrying on, kind of thing. I had no idea that I had been experiencing anxiety. And I had no idea that my needs weren't, my emotional needs weren't really being met. And I didn't know how to meet them myself. So it turns out, how was it going to raise a child with what I describe as an anxious disposition, which means it doesn't mean it has to present itself in any negative way, but highly sensitive human beings, there's plenty of us around. And when we've got that extra sensitivity, we can be more prone to anxiety. And I was a pretty sensitive little kid. And instead of being acknowledged and validated for how I was feeling, unintentionally, I know my parents loved me and I know they did their best, but unintentionally, they bypassed my emotional needs. And I felt, so I learned to shut down, to not show, not get upset, not express myself. And because they tell me, stop arguing, stop asking questions, stop this, stop that, because I had a very curious mind, because that goes hand in hand with an anxious temperament. You're very curious. However, if that anxiety begins to take over, you lose that curiosity. You lose a lot of your beautiful traits. because you're struggling and you're in crisis and you're in fear and protection mode because you've got this heightened defense mechanism going on. So I realise now, for 4 decades, I reckon every waking moment I had anxiety. It was just there. It lived in me. I just thought, I've got this weird condition and nobody knows what it is. There's something wrong with me, but I'm just going to soldier on anyway.
So if I may
Yeah, go on.
interject and just add something, because there's a point that you mentioned that I hear quite a bit, and it's in regards to as a child, I was experiencing this and it led me to go there. And one thing I want to share with you is that there's so many people that can pinpoint a lot of their struggles to their childhood. We sometimes, I think we forget that doing the best that you can sometimes, well, I'm not going to be as nice. Doing the best that you can a lot of times is not good enough.
Oh,
right? But the
yeah,
unfortunate part about it is when it's a family member, it's such a sensitive topic. Like, how does a child go to the parent and say that the way you raised me wasn't good enough? Because this is a conversation that you're probably going to have in your adulthood. So it could be 5, 10, 15 years of this type of treatment that has impacted you in so many different ways that you can't even begin to imagine. Or if it's someone that you're married to or someone that you're dating and you're going to them and saying that after 10 years, this is how I felt being with you. I'm letting you know this now because your emotional output, it's hit the fan. You can't deal with it anymore. You can't contain it anymore. And you simply can't run away from the feeling. So when you mentioned that you're going through the anxiety and then your daughter was going through it, was it at that point like a clash of the different sorts of anxiety? Or is it more so just maybe a different in upbringing because you know the upbringing that you had, and maybe you're trying to resolve that in some manner to make sure that she doesn't go through it, but now you're overcompensating? Was it something like that?
Oh, such a good question. Let's just say that when we hit crisis point, now I look back, I didn't know what the frick I was doing. I thought I did, but I didn't. And I wasn't meeting her emotional needs. I wasn't tuning in. And guess why? Because I'd never learned how to do it for myself. Because it starts here.